very complex civilization in the 1930s. After all, you had subways in Barcelona. Don't think that had every form of transportation that you know today, practically, with the exception of aircraft or the significance of aircraft. Even Barcelona had an airport. You had subways, you had streetcars, you had automobiles and buses, you had a complex industry, and yet they managed this through shop committees in the factories. They managed this through their trade unions without building the state, which you would normally expect would be a completely chaotic situation. So the ruling classes have always feared the participation of the people in an active sense. They want you to be there in a passive sense, to pay your taxes, to go to work, to vote, if you have a republic, for pre-selected candidates. Don't get too involved in this election. Okay? And then go home. They don't want you to hang around anymore. Go home. Be a good citizen. That's what they mean by law and order. Abide by what the representatives pass in the way of legislation. Follow the orders of the police. And just keep quiet. Shut up. Don't go out on demonstrations. Don't go out on sit-ins. Don't demand recall of candidates who have been elected. Don't get involved. They want you to get involved in voting, not in the political process. That's the only involvement they want to do. The essence of the Greek tradition and the way in which it should be translated into a future tradition is that you were involved every day of your life in political life. That is what politics originally meant, in contrast to what we today call state. It was also built on the idea that people were competent to do that. Given the right environment, given the right training, given a reasonable education, everyone was competent to make decisions about public affairs that are normally turned over to specialists and normally turned over to representatives, who alone, like given such brilliant minds as Reagan or Nancy, are competent to deal with national affairs. Chief executives, we all obey the chief. And we live with that for 4 years, whether we like it or not. We either re-elect that guy and his establishment, his astrologers, diviners, snake charmers, and whatever you have, whatever they've collected out there on the coast. And, or else, you know what I mean, you select somebody else. And they have another set of snake charmers and diviners, more professional, think tanks in various universities, Henry Kissinger, other such great, insightful people. But don't get involved aside from your election day, or campaigning for the candidate. That's also welcome, and your money is welcome for the various campaigns. To all of this, we have to counterpose and slowly build a counterpower. The word for it is dual power. There has to be a parallel power to the power that exists today. This is not a call to violence. It's not a call to insurrection. It's a call to the gradual transformation of consciousness and the gradual transformation of institutions such that there is a power at the base of society that can oppose the centralized power that exists at the top of society. We now know that inasmuch as the romance of insurrections belongs to the past, certainly in the Western world. I mean, we are not in jungles right now, guerrillas wandering around in Guatemala, El Salvador, and whatever you like, or formerly in Vietnam, and so on and so forth. And it would be silly to try to do that, because the amount of social discontent has not even been defined in America. We have to define that social discontent. We have not really learned how to define that social discontent. We've learned how to diffuse it. When you go into a Jackson campaign, you diffuse it. You let this big man talk for you, you know what I mean? No dope, have hope. And he alliterates all over and rhymes. The kind of sloganeering I personally find just personally unpleasant. With all due respect to this evangelical type of preaching, I prefer my politics in a very straightforward manner, in the prose of reality, and not in the mythos of a seeming rather vulgar poetry. I may say this frankly. But that's my preference, and that's my view. Under those circumstances, we have to start reconstituting the meaning of politics. We have to redefine it. We have to recognize the changes in consciousness that go into this. That is our program. I mean, our problematic, more precisely. The program that will do that will follow. And we have to be prepared for what is very much the long haul. None of this is going to take place rapidly. If you're looking for a quick fix, and either give up your hope and go for dope if you like, or, as many people would advise, go to a good analyst to calm you and soothe you and teach you how to adapt to conditions as they exist right now while they keep going downhill. And you don't even have to notice that they're going downhill. So I think that is the problematic we're faced with in summing up what we've been talking about over the last 3 weeks. Okay? And the question is, let's try to explore that given the limited amount of time we have, roughly 1 hour. Shall we take a break, or do people want to go into a question period or a discussion?
Break.
And the break is to be taken.
Can you're talking about dialectic. I was thinking about dialectic. The theory seems to transcend almost on the level of Jesse Jackson, in a different way, in that it buries the truth. It doesn't matter. But what I was wondering is, it seems like the language itself is deceptive. And theory, a lot of the theory I've read, in anarchy theory, like Smile Magazine, I tried to read through it, and, I was like, for example, you know what I mean?
I know what you mean, it's hard.
So how do we bring it down to everyday people like me,
By Sierra Club, and it's called The Rise of Urbanization and the Decline of Citizenship. And urbanization against cities from tribe to city, the creation of politics. It explains what politics is. And it gives a lot of examples of what politics were in the past. I know you're all exhausted, you look tired. I feel exactly the same way. In fact, I'm in physical pain because of the fall. And then it says from politics to statecraft, which is what we've been talking about. It goes into the social ecology of urbanization, which is more like the ambiguities of freedom in chapter 11 of the Ecology of Freedom. And then it literally writes out a whole program called a new municipal agenda. And I may tell you that this last portion is almost deliberately written to be a pamphlet, so that you don't have to read the rest of the book, actually. And I deliberately wrote it that way in the event that we could use it as a pamphlet in the Green Movement. So that it does not, the last chapter does not presuppose a reading of the earlier chapters or the previous chapters. Okay? And I'd like to touch on some of the themes in the book. But before I really do that, I sort of feel, in fact, instead of doing that to a certain extent, I'd rather lay down some issues that can be discussed amongst us. I'd like to, in other words, invite discussion and ask you, if you want to hear a more thoroughgoing discussion of this, to attend a 4-hour class on Wednesday, where we'll go into all the details, indeed go into the book itself in some detail. And I'll try to summarize a number of the chapters and try to give interpretations which I could not do even within the framework of that book. And it gets down to a number of problems. We have a long historical tradition of grassroots democracy, which could be traced back to the Neolithic, when in villages people gathered in collectives or assemblies, men and women, and made collective decisions. Gradually, these popular assemblies were transformed into councils of elders, from which you get words like older men, really meaning the elders of a community. irrespective of whether today these people are the elders or not, you hear the word the board of aldermen. So that the participatory popular council gradually was distilled and, as it were, pared away distilled from the populace in assemblies and pared away until it became a kind of like executive committee, and everything else fell away. Afterward, in the course of history, as you know, out of the executive committee came chieftains and ultimately monarchs, pharaohs, whatever you like, combined many different functions and even became deified. They were regarded as deities, as gods. The remarkable achievement of at least certain Greek cities, or poli, or polises, from which we get the word politics, was to restore this popular assembly, even though it excluded women, and even though it excluded strangers, and needless to say, you entered into a world where slavery had meaning, at least for those who owned slaves. Slaves could produce more than they needed to meet their own needs. So that if you owned 10 slaves, and each one produced enough to sustain 1/10 of a human being over and beyond his or her own labor, one person could be sustained by 10 slaves or 2 slaves. It depended upon the technology that you're talking about. And slavery became important. There are many people, for argument's sake, not for argument's sake, for example, who think that a figure like Aristotle tried to make slavery entirely natural and say that a slave was born to be a slave and a master was born to be a master, and that Greeks in particular were most suited to be masters, and everyone else who were called barbarians because they didn't talk Greek, because their language sounded like ba, 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 which is where the word barbarian comes from. The people who didn't talk Greek were meant to be slaves, or at least to be subordinate to Greeks, although this did not prevent Greeks from enslaving Greeks after wars, when they had prisoners of war. A thing that horrified Plato, for example, and was regarded as obnoxious to Aristotle. But barbarians were regarded as, we are normally told that barbarians were destined to become slaves, and that the Greeks believed that it was almost a genetic thing. The Greeks, being superior to everyone else, could turn everyone else if they caught them in war or bought them on slave markets, could turn them into slaves or use them as slaves. But there's ambiguity about that. Aristotle also, in his Politics, makes an amazing statement, which almost seems to countervail all of these ideas. He says, when weaving machines will weave by themselves, and the lyre, you know what that is, it's like a harp, when the plectrum, which is the instrument that they use instead of their fingers, because they need to get warm, when the plectrum could pluck the lyre and make music by itself, then we won't need slaves anymore. So he doesn't really anchor it in genetics, he anchors it in economics. You see what I'm saying? In other words, he says slavery is absolutely necessary, and if you don't think it's necessary, you might as well abolish. The idea of abolishing slavery is as absurd as to believe that weaving machines can weave by themselves or the plectrum can play the lyre by itself. Well, the plectrum can play the lyre by itself today, and weaving machines do weave by themselves. In fact, there are machines that are supposed to be able to think by themselves. We've gone that far. So that even slavery and oppression, economically speaking, had been justified by the need to have a ruling class because somebody had to do the work. You could not have culture, it was believed. And Aristotle makes a big point of that. You could not have politics, even in the democratic sense, unless there was someone to free people from the economic activity which absorbed so much of their everyday lives and left them only a restricted amount of time in which to engage in cultural activities and engage in political activities. Therefore, the great majority of humanity had to be placed in the service of a minority in order that this minority would have the means of life, would have the comfort and so on to elaborate a culture. Of course, this was very self-serving, no doubt, if you belong to that minority. But it also partly explained the problem.